10th of June 1944, Portsmouth Harbour, mid-morning. Drizzle stitched the sky to the sea, diesel fumes skimmed the grey water, and a barge nudged the quay as a column of captured Panzergrenadiers clattered down the gangway from Normandy. Feldgrau dark with mud, boots scuffed to raw leather, they had inched through hedgerows under the hammer of 8.8 centimetre guns and expected what defeat usually brings: shouts, blows, hunger. The corporal at the head braced for the first kick. Instead, he met a cool voice and a hand directing him to a painted line. "Form up. You'll be processed shortly," the officer said without heat, and the men blinked at a reception pen swept clean, a desk laid with forms, and a kettle steaming on a brazier that smelled impossibly of home. He smelled it before he understood it. Fresh bread, hot tea, a thin but honest soup. Identity discs were read off, and unit numbers written down in tidy columns, pockets emptied into metal trays, belts and bayonets tallied, field dressings replaced with gauze white as the sky. Royal Army Medical Corps orderlies worked with brisk impersonal care, iodine sharp in the nose. Postcards waited for prisoners to notify families, an almost pedantic nod to the 1929 Geneva Convention. Expecting anger, the men encountered procedure. Preparing for humiliation, they met courtesy. A German corporal would later write that the silence, not the sentries, kept his spine straight, registration, delousing, rations, then tarpaulined lorries to temporary cages inland, and, beyond them, camps scattered across Britain. Bewilderment thinned into wary relief. The enemy meant to keep them alive. By month's end, more boatloads would follow from the beaches and bocage, each arrival echoing the same quiet reversal. This morning in Portsmouth did not end a soldier's war. It began another campaign of rules, resources, and deliberate choices, and to understand it, we turn next to how Britain decided on this policy, and why. The first years of the war saw relatively few German soldiers fall into British hands, and this scarcity shaped both expectations and policy. From September 1939 through the campaigns of 1940 and 1941, most German forces were advancing rather than surrendering. The British Expeditionary Force withdrew at Dunkirk. The North African Desert Campaign moved in long arcs of advance and retreat. The Eastern Front consumed the bulk of German manpower far from British reach. As a result, the United Kingdom held only small numbers of prisoners, usually naval personnel captured at sea, aircrew brought down over Britain, or isolated detachments taken during raids and commando operations. Archival returns from mid-1943 show that the total German POW population in Britain remained limited, a number small enough to be handled within existing military facilities and without major public visibility. Rationing was already firmly in place by this time. Meat, fats, sugar, and even clothing were strictly controlled, and the Blitz had left cities marked by rubble and grief. Public patience was not limitless, and the idea of feeding the enemy struck many as intolerable. This balance shifted dramatically after the North African campaign concluded in May 1943 with the surrender of Axis forces in Tunisia, and it shifted again with even greater magnitude after the D-Day landings in June 1944, the destruction of German defensive lines in Normandy and the breakout. Across France produced the largest mass capitulations the Western Allies had yet seen. What had once been a matter of dozens or hundreds became tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. Britain now faced the reality of housing, feeding, and administering large bodies of surrendered soldiers at a moment when its own civilians queued daily for ration staples and its cities strained under years of war weariness. German infantrymen and NCOs, hardened by propaganda and battlefield rumor, arrived expecting cruelty, starvation, or revenge. The British government, however, confronted a practical and moral question: how to manage so many enemy soldiers while maintaining its own legal obligations and wartime stability. With this context established, we can now examine how Britain developed the systems of labor, accommodation, and cultural oversight that would define life inside the camps. By the summer of 1944, Britain had developed a structured, rather than improvised, approach to managing German prisoners of war. The system rested on three interconnected pillars, each derived from the 1929 Geneva Convention and adapted to Britain's wartime needs. The first was material provision. food, shelter, medical treatment, and clothing. Standard camp layouts used prefabricated Nissen huts, corrugated steel half-cylinders erected quickly on concrete pads, heated by small coal-fired stoves. Each prisoner received blankets, boots, and clean undergarments when required, and rations were calculated at roughly 2,400 to 2,600 calories per day, depending on the camp's labor demands. This was enough to sustain fieldwork, forestry, or construction, but did not suggest luxury. British authorities maintained that these standards demonstrated adherence to international law, while also ensuring prisoners remained healthy enough to be useful workers. The second pillar was labor deployment. By August 1944, the War Cabinet formally approved the widespread employment of German POWs inside Britain, a decision driven by acute agricultural and industrial shortages. With much of the male civilian workforce in uniform, farms lacked hands to bring in harvests, repair hedges, or manage livestock. By late 1944, approximately 70,000 German prisoners were working in British agriculture alone, and thousands more in logging, road repair, and salvage operations. Labor was paid at modest camp rates, recorded in chits rather than cash, which could be spent in small camp canteens. The work served dual purposes, easing Britain's manpower crisis and keeping ranks of able-bodied soldiers occupied in orderly routines. The third pillar was ideological oversight and reorientation. The political warfare executive, working with the POW division, organized lectures, supervised reading rooms stocked with approved texts, and screened documentary films that presented wartime realities, including evidence of Nazi crimes. Participation varied, and responses ranged from resentment to genuine reconsideration. These three components, material stability, labor discipline, and controlled exposure to alternative political ideas, constituted the technical framework that defined life inside Britain's POW system. With these mechanisms in place, we turn now to the first large waves of arrivals and the prisoners' initial reactions to a captivity. That was not what they had imagined. The T1 breakout from the Normandy bocage in July and August 1944 marked the first sustained influx of German prisoners to Britain. As German defensive lines collapsed and supply networks disintegrated, whole companies and battalions surrendered rather than continue fighting with dwindling ammunition and no prospect of reinforcement. What had once been small, infrequent captures now became continuous streams of exhausted infantrymen, Panzergrenadiers, Luftwaffe ground crews, and Volksgrenadier drafts folded into frontline service. These men were transported first to temporary cages in France, then to embarkation ports, and finally across the Channel to receiving depots in Britain. After the formal German surrender in the West on 8 May 1945, the scale expanded again. By September 1945, more than 200,000 German prisoners were held in Britain. By March 1946, the count stood at over 265,000, and by September of that year, it reached its peak at approximately 402,000. Among the central hubs that handled this flow was the transit camp at Devizes in Wiltshire, where men were registered, deloused, assigned to huts, and allocated to work details. The first groups to pass through Devizes carried the strain of prolonged defeat. Many had retreated through Holland or Denmark in the final months of the war, living for days on crusts of bread or boiled potatoes scrounged from farm stores. Others had sheltered in cellars during Allied bombing raids and arrived with their nerves frayed to breaking point. They expected to be treated with hostility, possibly brutality. Instead, they found order. Enamel mugs of hot tea, a measured ladle of vegetable soup, bread cut evenly at the ration table, and a queue that moved with quiet efficiency. Some stared as if the scene were a trick. Others, overwhelmed, wept openly. The transition from battlefield collapse to structured captivity was not only physical, but psychological. The shock of mercy had begun to unsettle assumptions. To understand how deeply this experience registered, and how the German prisoners themselves interpreted it, we now turn to the intelligence, reports and diary entries that recorded their earliest impressions behind the wire, German. Intelligence assessments and the private writings of prisoners themselves reveal how profoundly unexpected the conditions in Britain appeared to those who arrived in defeat. Some accounts were written clandestinely in camp notebooks, others were reconstructed after repatriation, but the sentiments align closely. One sergeant from a Panzergrenadier regiment later reflected that when British orderlies handed out soup on the first night, we believed it was mockery or perhaps poison. We were prepared for humiliation. Instead, they behaved as if we were simply soldiers who had lost. Such disbelief was not rhetorical. Months of propaganda had insisted that capture by the British or Americans would mean starvation and personal degradation. For men who had marched through burned villages and collapsing cities, the quiet routine of British camps felt surreal, as though the war had slipped into another world entirely. British War Office memoranda from late 1945 recorded that German morale in captivity remained more stable than expected, and reports intercepted by Allied intelligence from the disintegrating German High Command noted, with a tone of resignation, that British camps appear to be operating at a higher standard than many of our own rear area facilities. This comparison came not from sentiment, but from observation. Bowls washed in clean water, huts swept daily, medical stations stocked with gauze and antiseptic. Interrogation summaries from early 1946 display a recurring pattern. Prisoners confessed that they had prepared themselves for revenge. Instead, they encountered procedural civility. One airman said simply, "They treated our wounds before asking questions." Political warfare executive officers monitored not only morale, but conversation. Intercamp intelligence reports noted growing openness among some prisoners to the idea that the war had been lost long before surrender, and that the future of Germany might require reckoning rather than denial. This recognition, born from the shock of mercy, formed the psychological foundation for what came next. With these reactions in place, we now examine how Britain scaled this system into a nationwide labor and logistics network. Managing hundreds of thousands of German prisoners required Britain to construct a supply and administrative system that rivaled a field army in scale. Camps were not isolated stockades, but components of a coordinated national network. Many installations began as pre-war training grounds or temporary transit stations lined with Nissen huts, their semicircular steel ribs bolted to concrete pads. Others were established near farms and forestry regions to shorten transport to work sites. Each camp needed coal deliveries for heating, medical stores for infirmaries, and regular flows of rations. Despite civilian rationing, Britain allocated food, blankets, boots, and soap to prisoners at levels comparable to those issued to its own troops engaged in non-combat duties. War Office supply returns from 1944 and 1945 show crates of canned beef arriving from Canada, flour and grain consignments from Australia, and condensed milk, drawn from American Lend-Lease inventories. These provisions were measured, tracked, and distributed through military logistics depots already strained by 5 years of war. Labor deployment intertwined with this supply framework. Work detachments marched or were trucked to fields, rail sidings, and salvage sites each morning. Some prisoners harvested crops during late summer and autumn, helping to prevent food shortages that could have worsened rationing at home. Others repaired bomb-damaged railway embankments or cleared shattered brick and glass from the centres of London, Coventry, and Hull. By late 1944, approximately 70,000 German POWs were employed in British agriculture alone, with thousands more in forestry, road maintenance, and reclamation projects. Each detachment's output was recorded daily. Ration scales adjusted to labor intensity. Medical officers reported on health to maintain work efficiency. This was not improvisation, but a functioning logistical arm designed to convert defeated soldiers into a controlled labor force. The success of this infrastructure would shape how later intakes of prisoners were handled, and how the system evolved as the war drew to a close. In the next section, we examine how this model expanded and adapted as additional battlefield surrenders swelled camp populations even further. By the summer of 1945, as the guns fell silent in Europe, the role of German prisoners in Britain shifted from emergency wartime labor to a sustained contribution to national recovery. The countryside, especially in regions like East Anglia and Yorkshire, relied heavily on seasonal farmhands, yet so many British workers were still demobilizing or had been redirected to industry that fields lay understaffed at a critical moment. German POWs filled this gap. Detachments were marched each morning from camp gates to orchards, barley fields and dairy farms. The men who had once fired machine guns across hedgerows now lifted hay bales, cleaned livestock pens, harvested potatoes, and repaired dry stone walls. Records from August 1945 describe prisoners working in teams under the supervision of young British Home Guard or Territorial Army reservists, the guards often barely older than the men they oversaw. On many farms, the arrangement settled into a practical routine. German labourers developed a reputation for methodical work, shaped by years of military discipline. A former Panzer crewman might now manage cartloads of grain. A Luftwaffe mechanic could mend a tractor engine with the same careful precision he once applied to aircraft parts. Some farmers quietly noted that yields rose with the additional manpower. Though wages were accounted only as camp canteen credits and not paid in cash, the rhythm of labour provided structure and purpose, easing captivity's psychological strain. This shift in occupation represented something deeper than simple utility. For the prisoners, it marked a transition from instruments of destruction to agents of rebuilding. The tasks were modest, mending fences, stacking hay, but the symbolism was profound. The war had defined them as combatants. The fields redefined them as workers in a landscape untouched by ideological slogans. The effect on morale, both among prisoners and the British communities that came to rely on them, began to reshape the emotional terrain of captivity. With this practical transformation established, we now examine the psychological consequences for both sides. By the summer of 1945, as the guns fell silent in Europe, the role of German prisoners in Britain shifted from emergency wartime labour to a sustained contribution to national recovery. The countryside, especially in regions like East Anglia and Yorkshire, relied heavily on seasonal farmhands, yet so many British workers were still demobilising or had been redirected to industry that fields lay understaffed at a critical moment. German POWs filled this gap. Detachments were marched each morning from camp gates to orchards, barley fields and dairy farms. The men who had once fired machine guns across hedgerows now lifted hay bales, cleaned livestock pens, harvested potatoes, and repaired dry stone walls. Records from August 1945 describe prisoners working in teams under the supervision of young British Home Guard or Territorial Army reservists, the guards often barely older than the men they oversaw. On many farms, the arrangement settled into a practical routine. German labourers developed a reputation for methodical work, shaped by years of military discipline. A former Panzer crewman might now manage cartloads of grain. A Luftwaffe mechanic could mend a tractor engine with the same careful precision he once applied to aircraft parts. Some farmers quietly noted that yields rose with the additional manpower. Though wages were accounted only as camp canteen credits and not paid in cash, the rhythm of labour provided structure and purpose, easing captivity's psychological strain. This shift in occupation represented something deeper than simple utility. For the prisoners, it marked a transition from instruments of destruction to agents of rebuilding. The tasks were modest, mending fences, stacking hay, but the symbolism was profound. The war had defined them as combatants. The fields redefined them as workers in a landscape untouched by ideological slogans. The effect on morale, both among prisoners and the British communities that came to rely on them, began to reshape the emotional terrain of captivity. With this practical transformation established, we now examine the psychological consequences for both sides. The emotional and intellectual shift experienced by German prisoners in Britain was neither instantaneous nor uniform, but it was unmistakable. Many had braced themselves for humiliation and hunger, convinced by months of propaganda that the British would deny them even basic humanity. Instead, they found structured rations, orderly routines, and guards who enforced discipline without theatrical cruelty. The contrast was disorienting. Diaries recovered after repatriation speak of a quiet unraveling of certainty. One former infantry sergeant wrote, "Here, they feed us better than our officers did. Here I began to understand what civilization means." Another, reflecting on his first week in camp, noted that the most unsettling part of captivity was not confinement, but the realization that the enemy did not mirror the brutality imagined in wartime speeches. This change affected the captors as well. British guards and camp officers discovered that consistent fairness reduced tension and violence. Reports compiled by the Political Warfare Executive in 1946 observed that Nazi slogan chanting and resistance behaviors declined sharply in camps where work detachments were regular and reading groups or lectures were available. The shift from idle captivity to purposeful labor helped erode the psychological rigidity of defeat. The act of working, repairing a roof, harvesting grain, stacking timber, provided routine, and with routine came a sense of forward movement rather than suspended time. The enemy soldier became a worker, and in many cases a recognizable individual. Interactions between prisoners and civilians further softened hostilities. Farmers who initially regarded the POWs with suspicion found, over weeks of shared labor, that the men spoke of missing families, of ruined cities, of exhaustion more than ideology. Some guards reported that their own assumptions about Germans changed in turn. This mutual recalibration, slow, incremental, rarely dramatic, created conditions in which the war's ideological boundaries could loosen. These altered mental landscapes would soon have consequences beyond the camp fences, shaping how both sides imagined the future after the guns had fallen quiet. The British decision to treat German prisoners in accordance with the Geneva Convention and to employ them as a structured labor force produced outcomes that extended far beyond the perimeter fence. Tactically, every prisoner working in agriculture, forestry, rail repair or salvage represented a British or Allied soldier who did not need to be recalled from the front to fill shortages at home. In 1945 and 1946, when Britain faced critical food supply pressures and a rail system strained by both bomb damage and wartime overuse, POW labor helped stabilize essential services. In this sense, the camps were not passive holding areas, but active components of Britain's warfighting and post-war recovery apparatus. The work of German prisoners kept harvests on schedule, made roads passable, and ensured transport lines remained functional, each of which supported Britain's broader military and logistical operations. Strategically, the implications were deeper. By maintaining discipline through order rather than brutality, Britain reinforced its claim to moral legitimacy in the aftermath of a war defined by ideological extremism. The contrast between the British detention model and the forced labor networks run by the Third Reich did not go unnoticed among the prisoners themselves. Interrogation summaries and post-repatriation reports indicate that a significant number of returning POWs carried with them new attitudes toward governance, law, and civic responsibility. Some later described their captivity as the first time they had directly encountered functioning democratic administration. This did not convert every man, nor erase bitterness or grief, but it planted a conception of stability grounded in procedure rather than coercion. The cumulative result was that British victory appeared not simply as the triumph of superior force, but of controlled, lawful power. In the emerging landscape of post-war Europe, such impressions mattered. They shaped Reconstruction alliances, moderated resentments, and influenced how former enemies negotiated the terms of peace. With these gains established, we now turn to the limits of this system and the challenges that tested its stability. Even as Britain's policy of humane treatment and productive employment for German prisoners achieved practical and moral successes, it also encountered deep strains that forced continual adjustment. By late 1945, with rationing still biting hard, public patience began to fray. Civilians who queued for hours for small meat portions or shared one bar of soap among a family saw newspaper photographs of well-fed German prisoners working in tidy fields and reacted with anger. Letters to editors and questions in Parliament voiced resentment that the enemy eats while our children tighten their belts. Government departments were compelled to publish ration tables, proving that prisoners received no more than the minimum required for manual labor, roughly equal to British non-combatant troops, to diffuse political tension. These disclosures were meant to reassure the public that mercy had not become indulgence. Meanwhile, the POW population itself was far from uniform. Among the compliant labourers and re-education participants were men who remained fiercely loyal to Nazi ideology. The authorities classified prisoners into white, grey, and black categories according to political reliability. Those deemed black, hardline believers and agitators, were concentrated in higher security compounds such as Cultybraggan camp in Scotland, where internal violence and intimidation sometimes erupted. Maintaining order required both vigilance and a clear separation between reformable and incorrigible elements. British policy responded with tailored regimes, vocational classes and cultural activities for cooperative prisoners, stricter isolation for the recalcitrant. Economic and diplomatic realities added further pressure. Feeding and housing over 400,000 men became increasingly costly, and international expectation mounted for their return. Beginning in February 1947, Britain initiated mass repatriations, prioritizing the wounded and agricultural workers no longer essential to domestic output. By 1948, most had been sent home. The final phase of adaptation, vocational training, expanded re-education, and transparent resource accounting, helped maintain stability through this transition. With the administrative experiment concluded, its deeper meaning lay ahead: how this treatment of the defeated shaped post-war Europe and the men who returned to rebuild it. The effects of Britain's POW policy did not end at the moment the camp gates opened and men boarded trains for repatriation. The experience of disciplined routine, constructive labour, and measured dignity left marks that many former prisoners later acknowledged openly. Clean barracks inspections, scheduled work rotations, reading circles, and the simple expectation that one's word should match one's action became, for many, habits carried into civilian life. When they returned to towns and cities scarred by bombing and loss, these men brought with them not only memories of captivity, but also the practices of an ordered civic environment they had encountered among their former enemies. Approximately 25,000 German POWs elected not to return home at all, choosing instead to remain in Britain as farmhands, factory workers, or tradesmen. Their decision underscored the depth of the psychological shift. Captivity had become, for some, a bridge into a different vision of society. Sociologists examining the early Federal Republic in the 1950s and 1960s identified a subtle but distinct influence from the cohort of former prisoners held in Britain. They were noted for punctuality, disciplined work habits, avoidance of political extremism, and an emphasis on personal responsibility within democratic institutions. These traits did not originate solely in the camps, but captivity provided space for reflection, at a moment when Germany itself offered little stability. British policymakers, looking back, saw the POW system as a proving ground for the principle that reconstruction could flow from restraint rather than retaliation. Historians have since argued that this approach contributed to the relative stability of Western Europe in the immediate post-war decades. The British model demonstrated that the defeated could be incorporated rather than crushed, that the aftermath of war could be shaped by rebuilding rather than vengeance. The journey that began in shock, when a weary soldier stepped off a transport ship expecting hatred and instead received warm bread and ordered calm, ended in the quiet legacy of men who rebuilt homes, farms, and lives with a different understanding of what victory and peace could mean. In the pale frost of a Wiltshire morning in early 1947, a final column of German prisoners stood assembled beside repatriation trucks. Their greatcoats were patched but clean, their packs neatly rolled, their faces fuller and steadier than when they had first stepped onto British soil. Across the field, the roofs of the Nissen huts glimmered faintly under a thin winter light. The men who had once imagined captivity as starvation and humiliation now bore different memories: harvest work in late summer, conversations over evening, tea, the steady rhythm of labour that made the days comprehensible again. The corporal who had braced for poison in his soup now carried a small English grammar book tucked alongside his pay-chits, and letters from a farmer's family who had thanked him for his work. As engines coughed to life and the trucks began to move, several men turned to look back at the hedgerows, the low stone fences, the guardhouse door left standing open. They had come as enemies and left as something altered, Not wholly reconciled, perhaps, but changed by the simple fact of being treated as human beings rather than symbols of defeat. Britain's victory was not only in tanks and bombers, but in the refusal to answer brutality with the same. The story of these prisoners, once instruments of a violent ideology, now bearers of quieter knowledge, reminds us that the end of war need not be the end of grace. Sometimes peace begins with bread, routine, and a door that does not slam shut behind a departing man.